In show business parlance, this is known as the warm-up act. That's just to get you prepared. Well, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, born in 1918, died in 2008. Sorry. Technical hitch here. Yes. Am I coming through? Thank you. He's one of my heroes, not only because of his fantastic writing. If you've ever read anything, even in translation, he's an amazing writer. He personifies part of the 20th century and a period of history, and he still speaks to us today about our situation. In fact, I wonder what he would say to us today with Facebook and Google and the mass media and the whole COVID scare and so on. He might have something very interesting to say. He was called a colossus of courage. This was one man who ended up standing up almost alone, in fact, pretty much alone because everyone was too scared to stand by him, up against the entire Soviet Empire. And he suffered under it. He lived through some of the most momentous times in history, as I say, from 1918 onwards, a period of turmoil. And his books, both fiction and non-fiction, reflect his world and where he grew up. He went from prison and banishment to restoration and appreciation in his own homeland. He was shaped by the world he lived in, as of course we all are, but he grew up in the Russian Revolution, having been born the year after the revolution took place, or started out. And what I want to do tonight is just to give you a look at him and his work, the time he lived in, give you a brief biography, a look at his world and his books, and then a short look at his time in the West and his faith. I think we've got a technical hitch here, it keeps coming and going. But first of all, we have the young Solzhenitsyn. That was him at an early age. You can see he was destined to be a soldier. He was born in 1918 in Kislovodsk, southern Russia. His father was a soldier who died before he was born, so he was raised by his mother, no father. And as you know, that can have an effect on kids. He was thoroughly indoctrinated into communism at school. As you can imagine, it was perhaps not even forced down their throats, they were just immersed in communism. Not soft communism either, this was the real hard, pure Marxism. He was interested in literature and science and was accepted at the Rostov State University. And he graduated with degrees in mathematics and physics. And from my point of view, that's another reason to admire him, because those are areas that I don't do too well in. And he had great ambitions to be a writer, but of course, in the Soviet Union, you could only be a writer if they told you could be a writer. And he was a mathematician, not a writer. And he actually started writing a book about the First World War and the Revolution, and this eventually became a multi-volume work published as The Red Wheel. That's him as a student in his early days. And then the Second World War broke out, and Solzhenitsyn, with his maths background, was drafted into the artillery. He was decorated several times and promoted to captain. And he was involved in fierce fighting in Eastern Prussia when the Soviet armies invaded Germany. And that is precisely where the first book of the Red Wheel saga, August 1940, takes place. And then came the turning point in the life of this young officer, just before the end of the war. He was an enthusiastic communist, but he relates what happened, and I'm going to read most of his recollection of what happened. He says, "Mine was probably the easiest imaginable kind of arrest. It did not tear me from the embrace of kith and kin, nor wrench me from a deeply cherished home life. One pallid European February, it took me from our narrow salient on the Baltic Sea, where, depending on one's point of view, either we had surrounded the Germans or they had surrounded us, and it deprived me only of my familiar artillery battery and the scenes of the last months of the war. The brigade commander called me to his headquarters and asked me for my pistol. I turned it over without suspecting evil intent, when suddenly, from a tense, immobile suite of staff officers in the corner, Two counterintelligence officers stepped forward hurriedly, crossed the room in a few quick rounds. Their forehands grabbed simultaneously at the star on my cap, my shoulder boards, my officer's belt, my map case, and they shouted theatrically, "You're under arrest!" Burning and prickling from head to toe, all I could exclaim was, "Me? What for?" And even though there's usually no answer to this question, surprisingly I received one. And he says it's worth recalling. He heard himself, he's being urged to the exit, the shells from the Germans were falling around them, so these security officers were a bit nervous and wanted to get out of the area as soon as possible. And he says, then I heard myself firmly addressed. Across the sheer gap separating me from those left behind, a gap created by the heavy falling word arrest, across that quarantine line, not even a sound dared penetrate, came the unthinkable magic words of the brigade commander. "Solzhenitsyn, come back here." With a sharp turn, I broke away from the hands of the smashed men and stepped back to the brigade commander. I'd never known him very well. He had never condescended to run-of-the-mill conversations with me. To me, his face had always conveyed an order, a command, wrath. But now it was illuminated in a thoughtful sort of way. Was it from shame in his own involuntary part in this dirty business? 10 days before, I'd led my own reconnaissance battery almost intact out of a fire pocket in which the 12 heavy guns of his artillery battery had been left. Now he had to renounce me because of a piece of paper with a seal on it. "You have a friend?" he asked weightily. "A friend on the 1st Ukrainian front?" "It's forbidden. You have no right," the captain and the major of counterintelligence shouted at the colonel. I had already understood. I knew instantly I'd been arrested because of my correspondence with a school friend, and understood from what direction to expect danger. Zakhar Grigorievich Travkin could have stopped right there, but no. Continuing his attempt to expunge his part in this and to stand erect before his own conscience, he rose from behind his desk and reached across the quarantine line that separated us and gave me his hand, although he never would have done that had I been a free man. And pressing my hand while his whole suite stood there in mute horror, showing warmth that may appear in a habitually severe face, he said fearlessly and precisely, "I wish you happiness, Captain." His arrest was prompted by a single line in a letter to a friend, where he referred to the moustached one. And Joseph Stalin, of course, had this rather large moustache. And that is what he was arrested for. He quickly disappeared into a labor camp, part of what we know as the Gulag Archipelago, and I'll explain that later, with an 8-year sentence. For one sentence, he got an 8-year sentence. That's him as a prisoner. And that's the Gulag Archipelago. The areas in red indicate groups of camps under the Gulag control system. And the hammer and sickle, you can't see them, it's these other ones. Individual camps under control of local authorities. You can see how widespread it was. Instead of islands, this archipelago had these camps. And at its height, that's under Stalin, Soviet Union operated 1,976 concentration camps, 273 prisons, 85 psychiatric prisons, because if you oppose communism, which is so great, you're obviously a bit nuts, so you need psychiatric help, and 41 death camps. And in this gulag, there were incarcerated over 5 million political and religious prisoners. That's important. Not just people who'd fallen foul of the system or said the wrong thing, but people who believed. Between 1918 and 1953, that's under Lenin and Stalin, over 50 million Russians, that's almost our entire population, 50 million served long sentences in the Soviet concentration camps, with millions of them perishing. I saw a documentary of one in the east, somewhere up here in the Kamchatka Peninsula, and as the rains have washed the earth away, the bones are starting to show of prisoners who were buried there. He was a prisoner. He served the first part of his sentence in several work camps of mixed inmates, the political and the criminal elements. And the criminal elements were generally allowed free rein. In fact, they were used by the camp authorities to almost keep the political people in control. And when we say they had long sentences, you might get a 10-year sentence. And just as it expires, they'll hit you with another 10-year sentence, known as a tenor. So you could, in fact, spend your entire life serving out sentences in a concentration camp. In 1946, because he was a mathematician, he was transferred to a group of scientific research institutes of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Ministry of State Security. And he spent the middle part of his sentence in such special prisons. They didn't just do hard labour there, they actually did scientific work. And he used this period to, he drew on this period to write his novel First Circle, where the prisoners they've got privileges, they're not out in the sticks, they were actually near Moscow. And they had access to all sorts of scientific equipment, and they were expected to produce things for the state. In the book, what they're working on is a system, which of course is easy to do these days with electronics, but it was to print on wetted paper the patterns a voice makes, and to use that to trap people who, and especially one person who had phoned a warning to somebody about being arrested. That's the sort of thing they did. He was then transferred to Ekibastos, a newly established special camp in Kazakhstan. You can see it's way out in the sticks. There's Moscow over there. So it's a matter of getting people out of mainland Russia and into the rural areas, the steppes, where the winters were bad and the summers were bad. He used his experiences there to write a play. He also then, and I've got to cut this short, I'm getting the 2-finger mark, he contracted stomach cancer and it was operated on but not cured. However, he had an amazing experience that relates to him and to what's happened. This is what he looked like as a prisoner. He says, following an operation, I'm lying in the surgical ward of a camp hospital. I cannot move, I am hot and feverish, but nevertheless my thoughts do not dissolve into delirium. And I'm grateful to Dr. Boris Nikolaevich Kornfeld, who's sitting beside my cot and talking to me all evening. The light has been turned out so it will not hurt my eyes. Fervently he tells me the long story of his conversion from Judaism to Christianity. I'm astonished at the conviction of the new convert, at the ardour of his words. I was wakened in the morning by running about and tramping in the corridor. The orderlies were carrying Kornfeld's body to the operating room. He had been dealt 8 blows on the skull with a plasterer's mallet while he slept. And so it happened that Kornfeld's prophetic words were his last words on earth. And those words lay upon me as a sort of inheritance. Remember, this is a hardened communist soldier we're talking about. That's what the camps were like. You got searched as you went in and out to work. After his 8-year sentence, he was spied. He was exiled for life out of Russia into the what's now Kazakhstan and the other stans. It was a common procedure. His cancer developed rapidly, and at the end of 1953, he was near death. He went to a cancer hospital, and his experiences there gave rise to the novel Cancer Ward. Under Khrushchev's regime, Stalin's crimes were revealed, not surprisingly because Khrushchev had been participating in them. But he was able to publish for the first time A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was his first published work. But later on, Brezhnev took over and he was in danger again. His autobiographical novels were smuggled out and published, and that threw him into more trouble. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, but he couldn't leave to go and receive it. He was hemmed in. In 1973, his main work, the Gulag Archipelago, which is 3 volumes covering the Gulag and what went on in it, was published, and he was arrested again and charged with anti-Soviet treason and exiled from the Soviet Union to eventually live in the USA. He lived mostly in Vermont, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he's invited back. His Russian citizenship was restored to him. And he even met the president. There he is meeting Vladimir Putin, and that's a statue, Putin dedicating it. He died at 89, and his death caused considerable mourning in Russia, and he had a state funeral. But what was his world like? And I'm going to be very brief. From 1925 to 1953, Stalin ruled the Soviet Union, and under his rule, more people were murdered or deliberately killed in some ways than in both world wars combined. It was said that for 3 generations of Russians, death had a name: Stalin. People dropped dead in the streets from starvation, others were snatched off the streets or out of their homes by the NKVD, which became the KGB. And he said this: the world has never known a godlessness as organized, militarized, and tenaciously malevolent than that preached by Marxism. Within the philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, at the heart of their psychology, hatred of God is the principal driving force. Militant atheism is not merely incidental or marginal to communist policy, it is the central pivot. I'll skip over all the things that happened there, just go on to his books, and I've mentioned some of them. The last one, The Oak and the Calf, was his story about how he eventually got published in the Soviet Union. And that little one, We Never Make Mistakes, was a chilling one, and the plot is a railway worker during the Second World War suspects that a soldier, instead of returning to the front, is actually trying to desert, and he reports him to the NKVD. And then later on, after the man's been arrested and taken away, he goes to the NKVD office and says, I might have made a mistake. And the officer says, don't worry, we never make mistakes. And that should send chills down your spine. He arrived in the West, and in the West he realized that Christianity was banalized and the West was slowly degraded and collapsing because of secular humanism, which is a driving force of communism. And he said this before the US Congress: until I came to the West myself and spent 2 years looking around, I never could have imagined to what an extreme degree the West had actually become a world without a world gradually petrifying in the face of the danger confronting it. Think about America today. And he said in his Templeton address, more than half a century ago, and this is one of the things that marks him, while I was still a child, I recalled hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why this has happened. And that's why we have to look at our world today. Men have forgotten God. You see what's happening? He went on, said this in an essay called Live Not by Lies. Let us make a choice, whether consciously to remain a servant of falsehood, or to shrug off the lies and become an honest man worthy of respect by both one's children and contemporaries. And he had a whole list of things that you should not do. You should not assent to being deceived. And truth was his keystone. And he said, one word of truth outweighs the entire world. And in this mist of lies that we're being fed continuously, that is something worth remembering. Just briefly, very briefly, he was a Christian, Orthodox, but not, shall we say, for Trump. And in the novel, one novel, a Baptist prisoner tells him to be grateful he's in prison. He's got time to contemplate. And later he wrote this: bless you, prison, bless you for being in my life. For there, lying upon the rotting prison store, I came to realize that the object of life is not prosperity, as we're made to believe, but the maturity of the human soul. And he described the Christians as a self-confident procession through the archipelago, a sort of silent religious procession with invisible candles, a steadfastness unheard of in the 20th century. The Gulag could not touch these people who were sustained in their faith that they were loved by God. Thank you.